Hi, and welcome back to this Friday edition of Focal Point on AFR Talk. Brian Fisher is my name. Honored, and the program is Focal Point. The network is AFR Talk, the American Family Radio Talk Network. Honored to welcome to our decision maker line a frequent guest on this program, Dr. Cal Beisner. Cal is the founder and national spokesman for the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. Go to cornwallalliance.org for more information. This is an organization that's doing a fantastic job of bringing solid theology and solid science together. Remember, we do not have to choose between science and theology. Now, there can be a conflict between bad theology and good science. There can be a conflict between good theology and bad science, but it's not possible for there to be a conflict between good theology and good science, because the same God, the same creator, the same author is behind both. And Cornwall Alliance doing a great job of bringing both the theology and the science together to give us a balanced perspective on the whole issue of environmentalism. Cal, welcome back to Focal Point.
Well, Brian, thanks much for having me back, and thanks for all of your kind words about the Cornwall Alliance.
Well,
Brian, I want you and I want your listeners to know how much of a sacrifice I'm doing for you. I'm at a conference in St. Louis, and in order to have quiet and strong signal, I'm standing outside in this Arctic air mass at about 30 degrees, enjoying global warming in action.
So based on your personal observations, that global warming thing is not a happening thing. Well, I've got some stories in the stack here, Cal. I mean, I've got stories in the stack, frigid temperatures across the entire United States. I've got stories about a snow tsunami in Russia. I mean, it's burying cars. It's burying buildings. They call it a snowpocalypse. I've got a story about climbers being killed by an avalanche in Scotland. Most people don't even know there's snow in Scotland, and you have an avalanche that's actually threatening lives.
Yeah. Now, of course, we can't use this brief thing as an argument against global warming. I mean, what's happening today, what happens even in a week or two, something like that, that's weather. That's not climate. Climate is long-term. But you can be doggone sure that if instead we had way above average temperatures right now all across the northern hemisphere, certainly all across the northern United States, the global warming alarmists would be having a heyday saying this was proof. This is what you can expect from global warming. Well, actually, that's not the case. However, this isn't a short-term deal. We know already from clear global statistics that there has been no warming in the past 17 years. The Met Office in Britain now forecasts no warming for the next 5 years. And furthermore, we have just now found, data released by NASA has just confirmed that, in fact, we've actually seen a consistent cooling of the atmosphere for the last 5 years. So, just check global warming off of your list of deep concerns.
Well, I'm looking at a couple of stories here, Cal, one from the American Thinker, one from the Climate Depot website about these ex-NASA scientists, and I don't know if you're referring to them, but NASA's and some of the guys at NASA, I think James Hansen maybe is a NASA guy, and he's been out there kind of creating the impression that NASA science and scientists are all behind this theory that man is causing this catastrophic global warming. Well, they're calling it climate change now, but man's behind all this extreme weather. But here you've got some very prominent scientists coming out and saying, look, it's not true.
Yeah, that's the case. Bert Rutan is one of the spokesmen for this group of current and former NASA scientists, top-notch people from a variety of different scientific specializations who are all saying, look, the data simply show that we do not have any kind of an unusual warming period going on. This is natural, and in fact, we've had no warming for the last 16, 17 years, and we've had cooling over the last 5 years. 2012 only just barely made it into the list of the 10 warmest years in the period of record, and that period of record actually only goes back to 1979 when we started doing satellite temperature measurements around the world. So 2012 only barely got into the top 10 by a whisker, namely 1/1000th of a degree.
Well, and when you look at...
which is statistically simply meaningless. We can't even measure that in terms of global temperature.
Well, and when you look at hottest decades in American weather history, my understanding is the 1930s were the hottest decade that we've had, hotter than the one we are living in right now.
Yeah, much warmer than the one that we're in right now. And that period happened before CO2 concentrations rose to a point where anybody on the alarmist side would have said that they would have had any impact on global average temperature changing over time. So the 30s were definitely warmer, not just here in the United States, but they were warmer all around the world than the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s.
You know, one thing that struck me, Cal, on this piece, and you and I talked about this before, but it bears repeating. One of the things that because this lie is so widespread that these ex-NASA scientists said, look, one of the problems here is environmentalists have been, this is the word, grossly misled about what they think about CO2.
Yeah, they have been grossly misled, and so has the public by the environmentalists who grossly misled themselves, then go out and grossly mislead journalists and the public. But yeah, I mean, they're afraid of CO2, where in fact, instead, they should welcome an increase in CO2 in the atmosphere because, first of all, it's a direct help to all plant life. On the average, doubled CO2 in the atmosphere brings on a 35% increase in plant growth efficiency. That means more crops, cheaper food. We feed the hungry around the world more easily, far less cost. We deliver people from hunger and starvation. But second, that added CO2 in the atmosphere, because it increases plant growth efficiency, spreads the range for all plants. They grow better under whatever conditions they encounter, which means then that you have widening of their range where they can grow successfully. That means, for instance, a shrinkage of deserts. It means more hospitable ecosystems for all the various animals and birds and everything else that live on the earth. That's all a good thing. It also means we don't have to farm so much land to feed everybody. And then finally, the added warmth in the atmosphere is a good thing. People thrive better in warmer periods of history than in colder periods of history. They're healthier, they're stronger. Cold periods, cold snaps kill 10 times as many people per day as do heat waves. So it's a good thing. I mean, where do people migrate to? Do they move from South Florida to Minnesota in their retirement years?
Nobody retires to Siberia. I wonder why that is.
Right.
Well, and one other thing, Cal, I want to ask you about the president's speech before we're done. So I'd ask you to comment briefly on this. But one of the things that struck me about these NASA scientists is that they said, look, the environmentalists and all this catastrophic climate change or global warming alerts are based on on computer modeling rather than hard data.
That's correct. The big problem is that you've got a lot of scientists who grew up thinking that if I can model it on my desktop, that's what's happening in the real world. That's not so. But many of these scientists basically grew up embracing what's now known as post-normal science. And post-normal science is like postmodern deconstructionism applied to science. Postmodern deconstructionism says language doesn't exist to convey meaning or truth. It only exists to project power. Well, this then says science doesn't exist to convey meaning or truth. It only exists to project power. And so then we begin to use supposedly scientific fears about environmental issues as a rationale to pursue our political agendas. And that's exactly what's happening with the global warming issue. Mike Hume, the professor of climate change at the University of East Anglia, in his book, Why We Disagree About Global Warming, specifically says that climate change is really not about science. It's not about changing temperatures and stuff like that. It's about how we achieve our visions for the transformation of society. He happens, by the way, to be a Marxist.
Well, and that brings me to President Obama's inauguration address. He said he's going to make this a big emphasis in his second term. Got an obligation. We will respond to the threat of climate change, and he refers to the overwhelming judgment of science. So I'd like to have you respond to that, Cal. We got about 90 seconds, but it seems with his socialist tendencies and what you just said that maybe it's possible that he's using this as a cover to bring about that kind of social transformation.
I think that is clearly so. He told us when he was running for president the first time that his aim was for a radical transformation of the nation. And what he means is to change it from a nation of liberty, of property, of free markets, and so on, to a nation of socialism, communism, fascism. That's really where he is. And he sees, I believe, that the global warming issue is one on which he can hang some of that, because fears of global warming lead to calls for reduced use of energy, controls on energy, but we use energy in everything that we do. Everything that we produce, we have to use energy to produce it. Everything that we transport, we have to use energy to transport it. So if you're persuading people that we face dangerous global warming, you can then persuade them that we have to use drastic measures to reduce our use of the most abundant, affordable, reliable energy sources, nuclear, coal, natural gas, oil, and replace them with far less abundant, far less affordable, far less reliable wind and solar. That just puts people under the thumb of government rulers.
And one last comment, Cal. We only got about 30 seconds here, but he refers to the overwhelming judgment of science, but we've just seen with these NASA scientists that there isn't an overwhelming judgment of science on this. 20 seconds.
Absolutely. Not only is there not an overwhelming judgment of science, but the whole notion that a consensus of scientists would be proof of truth shows two things. One, you're ignorant of the history of science, which is loaded with overthrows of long consensus. And two, you're ignorant of the fact that consensus is not a scientific value. Evidence and argument are. Consensus is a value in politics, not in science.
Our guest has been Dr. Cal Beisner, the founder and national spokesman for the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. Go to cornwallalliance.org for more information. Cal, as always, thank you for risking your life in the frigid temperatures of St. Louis. God bless you, my friend.
Thank you,
Talk
Brian.
to you later.
God bless.
Focal Point AFR Talk.